Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at horror games, specifically ones that have been around forever.
Oh, okay. Like, what kinds?
Well, we're going to be going through an article from The Gamer. It's all about the longest running horror series.
Hmm, interesting.
So, you think you know horror games? Think again. This list has got some surprises, for sure.
I bet it does.
Yeah,
Like, I'm already trying to think what's, like, the oldest one I know.
I know, right? Before we get into the list, though, I'm kind of curious, how did we even get here?
What do you mean?
Like horror games as a whole genre. It's huge. Was it always this way?
Well, it definitely wasn't an overnight thing. I mean, you had some early games that, kind of set the stage.
What, like in the really early days?
Yeah, like, think Alone in the Dark.
Oh yeah, I remember that game.
1992, that one came out.
Yeah.
Really, it was a pioneer, for survival horror.
And then after that,
Well, things kind of exploded in the late 90s.
uh,
You had Resident Evil, Silent Hill.
oh for sure, those were massive.
Huge. They kind of like perfected the formula,
Mhm.
atmosphere, vulnerability, puzzles, jump scares, all that.
They became like the classics, right?
Totally. But then things started to change.
Oh yeah, like indie horror.
Exactly. Indie horror just blew up, bringing all these fresh ideas and like this raw intensity that you didn't see in the bigger games.
Yeah, and it felt like the big studios, the AAA ones, they were less willing to take risks on horror.
Right, exactly. Horror can be a bit niche, so it makes you think, how have these series, the ones we're talking about, how have they survived?
It's true. It's like they had to have a plan, like some kind of survival strategy.
Yeah, and that's what we're going to see in this list. Some were super innovative, some reinvented themselves, and others, well, they just had those diehard fans that kept them alive.
All right, I'm ready. Let's start the countdown. What's at number 8?
Number 8, we have Amnesia, debuted in 2010.
Amnesia. Ooh, yeah, that one's all about psychological horror, right?
Big time. Hiding, no weapons, just you and your fear.
The Dark Descent, that was the first one, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's the one. It really leaned into that hide-and-seek style. I think it, like, hit on something primal,
Yeah.
being hunted, the unknown.
It's funny you mentioned that. Didn't Amnesia blow up on YouTube too? Wasn't it one of the first big Let's Play games?
Oh, absolutely. I
think,
think it goes back to what I was saying, right? Watching someone else be terrified, that's like
Yeah.
we face that fear together.
Interesting. So Amnesia started strong, but how has it stayed relevant?
Well, the devs, frictional games, they're smart. They keep releasing new installments, building on the core stuff, but also twisting things up a bit.
So they keep it fresh.
Yeah, exactly. Like the newest one, Amnesia, The Bunker, it went in a slightly new direction and got great reviews.
Okay, what about number 7?
This one's a bit of a comeback story. Dead Space, launched in 2008.
Dead Space. Oh man, that game. The atmosphere, the dismemberment, pure space horror.
Pure space horror is right. Visceral Games, the studio behind it, they really went all out on the world building. Beautiful and
It
terrifying.
had a rough patch though, didn't it?
It did. Dead Space 3, it tried to go bigger, appeal to more people, but it ended up kind of turning off the core fans.
And then,
And then EA, the publisher, they shut Visceral down not long after.
which was a bummer because Dead Space 3 ended on this huge cliffhanger. So how did it make a comeback? I mean, it was basically dead.
Remakes, my friend. The remake of the first Dead Space.
Yeah, 2023 that came out. And it was huge. Reminded everyone why they loved the series in the first place.
So a good remake can really breathe new life into a franchise.
Cool.
Oh.
Speaking of comebacks, our number 6 is a bit under the radar, maybe, but it has a cool story. Fatal Frame.
Ah, Fatal Frame, also known as Project Zero in some places. This one's special.
It is. How so?
Well, it debuted in 2001, and it's like Japanese horror meets photography.
Photography. Wait, explain that one.
Instead of guns or whatever, you're using a camera to fight ghosts. You have to capture their essence to weaken them.
Whoa, that's different.
It is. And it makes the combat so tense, you're forced to get up close and personal with these terrifying ghosts.
So it's not just a gimmick, it adds to the horror.
Exactly. The early games, like the first one and Crimson Butterfly, they're classics for a reason.
Sounds like it had its ups and downs, though, right?
Oh, for sure. Kind of faded away for a bit. There was a Wii game, a 3DS spin-off, but nothing major. Then they released Maiden of Blackwater on the Wii U.
But the Wii U didn't exactly set the world on fire.
You got that right. But here's the thing. They got smart. In 2021, they ported Maiden of Blackwater to other consoles and PC. It did really well, opened it up to a whole new audience.
Yeah.
That led to the remaster of Mask of the Lunar Eclipse in 2023, which was originally a Wii game.
So basically, Fatal Frame found a second life through ports.
Exactly. Reaching new players proves that even games people might have forgotten can find success. Which brings us to number 5, a series that I think might be about to have a big moment.
Ooh, okay. I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
At number 5, we've got Silent Hill. First hit the scene in 1999.
Silent Hill, yeah. The psychological one, right? Less jump scares, more creepy vibes.
That's the one. Resident Evil's all action, but Silent Hill, it goes deeper. Trauma, guilt, facing your demons, all that.
It's the sound design for me. So unnerving.
Totally. But after the first 4 games, it kind of went off the rails. Different devs, different directions.
And then there's that whole PT thing.
PT, the heartbreak of PT.
What a tease that was. So good, then gone.
It was brilliant. Directed by Hideo Kojima, starring Norman Reedus, then Konami just cancels it.
The gaming world wept. But wait, weren't there rumors of a Silent Hill comeback?
There were, and guess what? In 2023, Konami announced a ton of new Silent Hill projects.
No way.
A remake of Silent Hill 2, a new main game called Silent Hill F, and some smaller spin-offs too.
Silent Hill is back, baby. Talk about dedicated fans.
Yeah.
All right, before we get too lost in the fog, let's move on. What's next? Man, some seriously creepy games we've talked about so far, but we're only halfway through the list.
Yeah, we're getting to the heavy hitters now, the top 4.
Okay, I'm ready. Hit me with number 4.
Number 4, we're moving away from like psychological stuff and into something more visceral.
Visceral. Ooh, okay. Am I thinking what you're thinking?
Yeah, you probably are. At number 4, it's The House of the Dead. First hit arcades way back in 97.
A House of the Dead. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in a while. I remember so many quarters went into that arcade cabinet.
Oh, for sure. Pure arcade fun, that game.
Yeah.
Fast action, over-the-top gore, those crazy bosses.
Yeah. Do you remember, like, the giant spider boss?
Then a magician guy.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, and who could forget those constant reload reminders?
Classic. What's kind of wild to me is, like, The House of the Dead has outlived its own genre. You don't really see many rail shooters anymore.
That's a really good point. I guess there's just something about blasting zombies that never gets old. But has it stayed, like, only in arcades?
Not entirely. They actually did a remake of the first one in 2022.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they put it on PC and console so a whole new generation could experience it. And they've kept making new ones for arcades, too.
Like what?
Scarlet Dawn. That was a recent one.
So even though arcades aren't what they used to be, the House of the Dead is still finding ways to reach players. Pretty cool. All right, on to number 3. And this one, I gotta admit, I don't know much about.
Yeah, this one's maybe a bit more niche, but it's got a dedicated following, that's for sure. At number 3, it's Corpse Party. Debuted all the way back in 96.
Corpse Party. Okay, fill me in. What's the deal with this one?
Okay, so Corpse Party, it's a Japanese horror RPG. Think students trapped in this haunted school.
Haunted School. Okay, I'm already creeped out.
Oh, yeah, and it gets worse. Gruesome deaths, psychological stuff, the whole 9 yards.
So like a cult classic kind of thing.
Yeah, you could say that. The first one was actually made by a group of students. They used this simple RPG maker tool.
Wait, seriously, like a student project turned into a long-running series.
That's the story. But it wasn't like super polished or anything. It was kind of rough.
So how did it become so popular?
Well, they actually did a remake in 2008, put it on the PSP. That's when it really took off. The remake, it had better graphics, more gameplay, and it really upped the scare factor.
Interesting. So it took a while to find its footing. Okay, so that brings us to the top 2. This is it, the big leagues. And I think I can guess what's coming.
Yeah, you probably can. At number 2, it's the king of survival horror, Resident Evil. Debuted in 1996.
Resident Evil, a classic. I mean, what more can you even say about this series?
Not much. It's one of the best-selling game franchises ever. Countless sequels, spin-offs, movies. They even have, like, a whole cinematic universe now.
I feel like Resident Evil has gone through so many changes over the years, and it's still going strong.
Exactly. It's not afraid to reinvent itself. You've had, like, fixed camera angles, over-the-shoulder action, even first-person stuff. It's always experimenting.
And that's going to be a big part of why it's lasted so long, right?
Totally. It evolves, but stays true to its core. And you gotta admit, it's got that campy charm, too. Those cheesy lines, the crazy villains.
Oh, absolutely. It can be scary, but it also knows how to have fun.
Exactly. But beyond all that, I think it's the characters, the creatures, the lore. People just love the world of Resident Evil.
And those remakes, they've been killing it lately, haven't they?
Oh, yeah. The Resident Evil 2 and 4 remakes, they're fantastic. Capcom, the developers, they really know how to modernize those classics.
So Resident Evil, a true horror icon. But there's still one more, the series that started it all.
This is it. Back to the origins of survival horror. At number 1, we've got Alone in the Dark, released in 1992.
Alone in the Dark, the OG, the one that paved the way. I remember playing this as a kid, man. It was terrifying.
Yeah, it's crazy to think it came out like 4 years before Resident Evil. It set the stage for so much of what we see in horror games today. Fixed camera angles, limited resources, puzzle solving. It all started here.
But if it's so groundbreaking, why isn't it as well known as, like, Resident Evil?
Well, Alone in the Dark's had a rough time, honestly. Bouncing between developers, different publishers, some good sequels, some not so good sequels.
Sounds like it got lost in the shuffle a bit.
Yeah, kind of overshadowed by its own successors. But hey, it's still alive. There's a new one out in 2024.
Really?
Yeah, I'm hoping this one will, bring Alone in the Dark back to its former glory.
I hope so too. It'd be great to see it get the recognition it deserves. Okay, so that's our list. From Alone in the Dark to Resident Evil, we've seen a lot of horror history today. But before we wrap things up completely, I wanted to ask you something.
Yeah, what's on your mind?
We've seen how these horror games have survived, even thrived, for decades. What does that, like, tell you about the horror genre itself?
It tells me that horror, it just has this power to stick around. It speaks to something deep down, our fascination with the unknown, with fear itself.
And I think that's especially true for horror games. Like, they let us experience fear in a safe way.
Yeah, it's like a controlled dose of adrenaline. We confront our anxieties and hopefully come out the other side feeling a bit braver.
But it's not all about the adrenaline, is it? There's got to be more to it than that.
Right. The good horror games, the ones that last, they go beyond just scares. They have good stories, they build incredible atmospheres, and they often explore some pretty complex themes.
Like, they make us think about the things we're afraid of, the things we try to hide from.
Exactly. And that's the real power of horror, I think.
You know, it's funny to think about how far horror games have come, like, graphically.
Oh, totally. We've gone from, like, blocky, PS1 era graphics to some crazy realistic stuff these days.
Yeah, but even with all the, like, advancements in technology, there's still something about horror that just, it doesn't age. It still works.
Totally. No matter how fancy the graphics get, we still get scared,
Yeah, and it makes you think, like, what is it about horror that's so timeless?
Well, I think it comes down to those, like, basic human instincts. We're wired to be afraid of the dark, the unknown, things that go bump in the night.
It's true. Even if we laugh at those old games now, back then they were scary.
For sure. And I think developers have gotten really good at, like, playing with those fears over the years.
Like, how so?
Well, just think about perspective, for example, like those fixed camera angles in the early Resident Evil games.
Oh, yeah, those were creepy.
Totally. You're always kind of looking over your shoulder, never quite sure what's coming next.
And then you had the shift to, like, over-the-shoulder perspectives.
Yeah, which made things feel more, like, immediate, up close and personal.
And now I feel like we're seeing more and more first-person horror.
Especially with VR, right?
Yeah. I mean, VR horror, that's a whole other level.
It really is. Suddenly, you're not just controlling a character, you are the character.
I tried a VR horror game once, and, yeah, it was a little too real for me.
I get that. But, even beyond technology, it's interesting to see how these series have, like, stayed relevant over the years.
Yeah, that's been a big takeaway from this whole deep dive. Like, every series has its own way of surviving.
Some are all about reinvention, right?
Yeah.
Like Resident Evil, they're always pushing the boundaries.
And then you have others like Fatal Frame, which almost disappeared, but then they brought it back with remasters and ports.
Reaching a whole new audience, it makes you wonder, like, what's the secret formula?
Yeah. What makes a horror game truly stand the test of time?
I think it's got to be a mix of things. The gameplay needs to be solid, obviously. You need that tension, that feeling of wanting to survive.
But I also think a lot of it comes down to atmosphere and story, right?
Totally. Atmosphere is huge. You could have the best graphics in the world, but if the atmosphere's not right, it's just not scary.
It's all about that, like, feeling of dread, that sense of place.
Exactly. And a good story, well, that's what really hooks you, Makes you care about what's happening, keeps you playing even when you're scared.
Like a good book that you can't put down even though you know it's going to keep you up all night.
Exactly. And some of these games, they really blur the lines between games and stories. You finish them, and they stick with you.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've seen how horror has evolved from those early days to now.
Yeah, from Alone in the Dark to Resident Evil, it's been a wild ride.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one last thing to think about. We've talked about how these series have adapted in the past, but what about the future? What's next for horror games?
Ooh, good question. What new ways will they find to scare us?
Will VR become like the ultimate horror platform? Will we see new horror icons emerge? I can't wait to find out.
Me neither. The future of horror gaming, it's looking pretty exciting. And maybe a little bit terrifying.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of long-running horror game series. Until next time, stay spooky.